There is something undeniably happening. Most of the growth, this isn't a radical thing to say, it's backed up by a lot of data, over the coming years is not going to come from traditional markets like Europe and North America. It is going to come from the Middle East. It is already coming from the Middle East.
Where do you see the future of tech, especially in a post-pandemic world?
I don't think there's any simple answer. I think there's lots of ways of slicing it. One is geographic. For 50 years, technology and advances within technology, be it semiconductors or computers themselves, was driven very much by the United States, in particular Silicon Valley, to a lesser degree Boston. What's happened over the last decade is sort of a rapid dispersion of technological capability to other parts of the world. It's been ongoing for several decades. I think over the coming decade, China in particular will dominate technology in a way that's almost difficult to appreciate at this point. But if you look at a recent RAND report that covers 26, I think, strategically important areas of technology for the United States, this is a major US think tank, and they've concluded that they are losing to China in 25 of those 26 areas.
Talk to me about the Silicon Valley mindset. You know, the fact that not everything has to be rooted in the West Coast anymore. You just mentioned that China is going to be taking over in terms of tech. So how does that look? And I suppose what kind of pushbacks will the tech industry experience now?
Throughout history, for almost thousands of years, some geographic center emerges with an edge in textiles, like in the Low Countries of Europe. So that's kind of around Belgium and the Netherlands. And that edge was eroded eventually by the British and others. And in time, the British were out-innovated by the Germans, and the Germans in time by the Americans. And before that, China and India were this kind of supreme engines for innovation in the world. So these things change. What drives it, I think, is not ultimately a mindset. It's the involvement of the state. Silicon Valley only exists because it's a subsidiary of the US Department of Defense. It was the laboratory that the US government gave outsized amounts of money to try and develop cutting-edge weapons technology for the most part. And sometimes spin-outs or components developed ostensibly for military purposes had a secondary purpose, which was they could be sold commercially. And over time, I think the United States has taken its foot off the important partnership between the public and private sector and almost left increasing amounts of innovation up to the private sector. And I think that's largely failed.
Why has it failed?
Because the driver of innovation historically has never been the private sector. It's not entrepreneurs, and it's certainly not venture capitalists. They're fantastic for commercializing nascent technologies, but those technologies are almost always developed in publicly funded laboratories. Sometimes those laboratories may be internal to private companies, but oftentimes they're attached to universities or other research laboratories. In the case of China has focused intensively on the important partnership between the state or the public sector and the private sector, and I think with quite stunning results. Before China, Japan was doing the same, and they caught up quite rapidly with the United States by pursuing a very tight and very strategic relationship between the private sector and the government.
Okay, well, I do want to talk about another topic that has set the tech world on fire, and it seems like this industry is really going through something, and it's all about, you know, AI and whether AI is going to replace us, it's going to take our jobs. And I know it's not just affecting tech, it's across the board as well. I think we've got the strikes going on in Hollywood because they're worried about losing their jobs to this technology as well. And when it comes to the art sector, you know, you have photographers winning prestigious prizes because they've used AI. But another huge concern about it is over misinformation and AI. So how much of a disruptor will this be for the tech industry, do you think?
Personally, and it's only my view, I think AI is very real. I just think with every wave of new exciting technology or an evolution within a particular field of technology, the hype sometimes can get out of hand. So it's absolutely real. There are really interesting things happening, but I just don't think that we're about to lose all of our jobs and that unemployment will be a systemic consequence of AI. For hundreds of years, thousands of years, technology has been replacing jobs. At a certain point, the wheel replaced a lot of people to move things around. And over time, the technology became more productive. It replaced even more humans, displaced more humans in the roles that they previously occupied. But that freed up, in most cases, people to pursue other higher order roles. I don't think that will be any different in the case of AI. If you rewind the clock a little bit, about 5 years ago, there was much hype around robots, and that robots, robo-taxis, robo-everything were going to replace jobs. But actually the available evidence from countries that have most intensively adopted increasing levels of robotification is that they tend to create more new jobs, and that's data from Korea and Japan. And I think it's a very natural and human reaction to worry deeply about the negative consequences of these technologies. But very often it's down to us as a society to choose what we wish to apply or what direction we wish to push these technologies. You can take GPS as a perfect example. GPS is wonderful for delivering some noodles to your house, but it can also be used to deliver a guided missile to your doorstep as well.
Yeah, if it falls into the wrong hands, then it's like
same technology, but radically different outcome. One incredibly positive, one incredibly negative. Every new technology is neutral at best, and it's up to us as societies to choose the path or the course that we are going to allow this technology to take.
It just keeps evolving and keeps on getting powerful. So who's going to do the regulating?
No, it's just got to be us. Cars are incredibly deadly technology. It's a deadly technology and still maims millions of people a year, cars, and cause innumerable deaths around the world. But we've decided that on balance, cars and automotive technology in general is a public good that we want to live with. And for a century, we have been introducing thousands of small little regulations to make cars safer, drivers more capable, and providing police, for example, with powers to try and implement and ensure those rules and ensure that our roads are relatively safe to drive on. And AI may end up in certain ways being used for deadly outcomes, but it should, provided we guide it in the right direction, and we can do that, it should be a very positive thing for the world.
Well, in regards to the fact that we are living in the age of information or misinformation, and when it comes to AI, I know that you are an investor in an online platform called The Ditch. Can you see how AI might affect everybody on every scale, but can you see how it might affect your platform as well? What do you think about it?
My view on disinformation or misinformation or various forms of propaganda is that there isn't a great deal of evidence to support a conclusion that the level of people that are likely to believe something that is untrue is growing. So it is true to say that a lie can spread faster than ever before, but it doesn't follow that more people are likely to believe that lie. And there's some great research done on that, published by the Columbia Journalism Review over the last half a decade. I think we should always be concerned about propaganda and its corrosive effect on society.
Away from AI, what are the other dominant themes that is coming across or coming up in tech, or
for us at Web Summit, we started a conference in Europe that for many of its earliest years attracted an overwhelmingly European and North American audience. The changes over the last half a decade are stark, and one of those changes is the rise of the participation from the Arab world. and there is something undeniably happening. And I think most of the growth, this isn't a radical thing to say, it's backed up by a lot of data, over the coming years is not going to come from traditional markets like Europe and North America. It is going to come from the Middle East. It is already coming from the Middle East. The rate of change, the rate of growth is quite unprecedented. And the change is also occurring in the region, which I think are very positive.
So have you seen any pushback from like the States and I suppose parts of Europe when it comes to, oh my gosh, we're seeing other people, other countries actually becoming more dominant?
Oh yeah, I think there's a growing insecurity in the West. Martin Wolf has an article in the Financial Times where he says, the G7 is sort of dead. The West is kind of no longer the only show in town. The world is multipolar and people need to move with the times. And I think sometimes the reaction in the West, sometimes in the United States, crying that their national security is under threat when it's just entirely obvious that they're being out-innovated in sector after sector by, in some cases, Chinese companies and sometimes companies from elsewhere in the world.
As we saw with TikTok.
Yeah, as you saw, I don't think TikTok has anything to do with national security concerns over, social media. The concern is that TikTok is out-innovating American social media companies and they don't want to tolerate that. And this is sort of like Groundhog Day, because if you go back over the business press and political reporting over decades, in the 1980s when Japan, this kind of new kid on the block, started initially biting at the toes or the ankles of the United States and then starting to really produce cars that Americans liked and started to buy at an alarming rate as far as America was concerned, they took sweeping action. They said that there had been state interference in Japanese car companies, as if there's never been state interference in American auto manufacturers, and they impose huge and crushing tariffs on Japanese automakers. And then you fast forward to the end of the 1980s and NEC was building better and cheaper supercomputers than their American equivalent. And in that case, it was Cray, who are now a subsidiary of IBM. And the United States, I believe it was the White House, said that US national security was under threat by this Japanese computer manufacturer, and they would have to ban Japanese supercomputers because of fears over spying. And you fast forward 20, 30 years later, and to me it would appear to be the exact same playbook. It's always the excuse is largely national security, but underneath the rhetoric is a reality, which is the US and Europe finds it difficult when companies from elsewhere in the world are beginning to outcompete them.
Well, when did you start to notice a change?
Well,
that switch or that pivot, like, oof, okay.
I'd love to say I noticed that change 20 years ago, but I think the change is now so apparent that you have the Financial Times saying, come on, everybody, the world is changing. We need to get with the program. Because otherwise, the West, I think, is at particular risk of antagonizing everybody else. And remember, it's only about 800 million people. There's effectively 7-point-something billion other people in the rest of the world. And all of a sudden, being a member of the BRICS is becoming incredibly attractive. Martin Wolf is saying the G7 is yesterday's news. You could say it's all about the G20, but I actually think it's possibly all about the BRICS. If reports from existing BRIC nations are to be believed, there's now more than 30 countries, all of the countries where almost all of the growth is going to come from over the next number of decades, demanding to be part of this club. And this club will very rapidly, I think, become the most important club in the world. And that makes being in the Middle East, being in Qatar, bringing Web Summit here incredibly exciting, because I think it's not about creating a regional event to bring entrepreneurs and investors from the region together. It's about bringing the rest of the world to Qatar, to the Middle East, and showing them that this is an incredibly important market. There's an enormous amount happening, both geopolitically but also economically. And you can't not be here. You have to be here, and you should be here playing by the same rules as everybody else.
Been described as world's largest tech conference and the Olympics of tech. And those are pretty big titles, if anything. When you do have titles like that, how do you keep on evolving and staying ahead of the curve? Like,
it's really hard. We sometimes put on stage companies that appear incredibly hot, and the following year they don't exist. And sometimes we decide not to put companies on stage that we don't think are going to be very successful, and the next year they are. Incredibly successful. The job of Web Summit is not to put on stage the status quo of today, the CEOs of the big blue chip companies. And there are sometimes we put some of them on stage, but the majority of companies on stage, hopefully you've never heard of, but some of them are going to play an incredibly important role over the coming years. So in the words of the Atlantic, people go to Web Summit to discover the future. And it's where the future goes to be born. I think there are tremendous conferences around the world to hear from those that are dominating today or setting the agenda of today. But if you want to discover the future and understand what's going to happen tomorrow, that's why companies go to Web Summit. And it's not just all of these fast-growing companies. It's some of the world's largest energy companies, mining companies, car companies who want to be there as well, because their CEOs, their C-level executives have a mandate to stay on top of these things. They need to know, are there huge conglomerates under threat, or are there companies that they can partner with and work with that could be transformative to their bottom line? And that's what Web Summit is. It's a bit of chaos as well. I mean, when you bring 70,000 people together, many of them entrepreneurs who don't take no for an answer, it's a kind of frenetic and incredibly exciting and crazy atmosphere.
And it's coming to Qatar next year. So what's the plan for that?
Yeah, the plan is to create, hopefully over time, one of the most important global gatherings in the Middle East. It's not a regional event. We'll be bringing attendees from all over the world, from Nigeria, from Japan, from Brazil, from Canada. And it will be an opportunity for them to meet with the best companies, the best startups, the best fast-growing companies from the region to potentially do business. And I hope it provides a powerful platform for the region and for Qatar to show the world that there's an incredible amount happening in entrepreneurship.
Okay. We have to end it there. See you next year, I suppose. But no, thank you, Paddy Cosgrave, for joining us at Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much.